Hello, everybody, and welcome into the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Moats. Well, we're halfway through January here in 2026. We haven't really had a measurable snowfall where I live in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Just a few overnight dustings. I know a lot of people out there hate the snow, but I love it. Not on the roads, of course, but I like when the ground is blanketed in white. I go out in the yard and play with the dog. I like building snowmen. I like sled riding, even as a 47-year-old man. Now, I don't like skiing or snowboarding, but I like watching people go down the mountain. And with the Winter Olympics on the horizon, I'm living large during snow season here in 2026. But you don't want to listen to Aaron the Snow Bunny. You want me to get along with today's show. We start with a listener question. Today's email comes from Sable, who says, "What would happen if Jar Jar Binks was in Legends? I mean, he is a Sith Lord. How would he react to meeting the son and daughter of Padme? Would he betray them? How would Luke react as well? Would he turn him back to the light and help him? Do you think Jar Jar would also attack the Solo kids? What do you think?" Well, thank you very much for your email, Sable. So, before I answer your questions, let me begin by saying that Darth Jar Jar is non-canon, not Legends. In fact, the Darth Jar Jar idea didn't even begin until more than a year after the Legends continuity ended in 2014. The idea began with an online Reddit post in 2015 that was eventually picked up by Lego Star Wars because it's weird, it's silly, and it's really funny. But that being said, Jar Jar Binks is in Legends in the comic series Star Wars Tales. Now, a lot of the things in those comics are totally outrageous, totally silly. And there's some other stuff in those comics that are a bit problematic, in my opinion. But Star Wars Tales does tell some of the backstory of young Jar Jar being raised by his parents on Naboo and why he was banished from Oda Gunga. But, Sable, let's say Darth Jar Jar was a thing in Legends. Do I think he would have tried to take out Luke and Leia? Absolutely. If for no other reason than to try to take them away from Anakin and Palpatine. Because that's what Sith do. They make life horrible for their enemies and for other Sith. As to whether or not Luke would try to help Darth Jar Jar return to the light, I think it would depend on when they met in the timeline. If it's before the end of Return of the Jedi, no. I think Luke would treat Jar Jar like every other enemy he met along the way. But if it was after Return of the Jedi, maybe. I think Luke would ask Darth Jar Jar to stop making selfish decisions and renounce the dark side of the Force. But I don't think Luke would put the same amount of time and effort that he did with his father or his nephew Jason. Finally, I'm sure Darth Jar Jar would try to take out the Solo kids, but I think it would most likely have been when they were younger children, because we see how difficult it is once they start their Jedi training. Not only because of their own Force abilities, but let's face it, Luke is there at the Academy. He's a powerful Jedi Master by that time. And the Solo kids are also surrounded by other Jedi Knights at the Academy. Thanks again for the questions, Sable. Listener, if you'd like to ask a question, you can send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Blue Sky, Instagram, or Twitter at swlegendslounge. And if you'd like to get your voice on the show, just record a short message and email it in. But please record it in MP3 audio format. Now it's time for today's episode, as I continue my journey through the young reader stories in the Jedi Apprentice series. Today I'll be covering books 5 through 8, written by Jude Watson. Their titles are The Defenders of the Dead, The Uncertain Path, The Captive Temple, and The Day of Reckoning. Listener, grab yourself a drink. Let's head in to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. Book number 5 in the Jedi Apprentice series is called Defenders of the Dead. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan are sent to the planet Malida Don, a planet where the two main groups of people, the Malida and the Don, have been at war for centuries. The Jedi Council sent a Jedi named Tal to try and broker a peace, but she's been taken prisoner by the Malida. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan are sent to negotiate for Tal's release, but they're also taken hostage. Now, luckily, they escape with the help of a girl about Obi-Wan's age, a teenager named Sarasi. Sarasi introduces the Jedi to a group of orphans who call themselves the Young. Their leader, an older boy named Neild, says the Young are tired of the fighting between the Malida and the Don. He says the two sides can't even remember what they're fighting about. So the Young hide out in the sewers and in the surrounding countryside, biding their time until they can end the war between their elders. Now the passion Neild and Sarasi speak with captivates Obi-Wan. He tells Qui-Gon that he wants to join the Young with their struggle against the elders. But his master says that's not their mission. They're here to find Tal. To Qui-Gon's surprise, Sarasi offers to guide the Jedi to where Tal is being held prisoner. She does, and they do find the Jedi Knight, blind and injured. Now, when the group returns to the Young's hideout, Neild tells Qui-Gon that the Young have stolen a cache of weapons from the Don, and they plan to force the elders to stop their war. Qui-Gon tries to get the Malida and the Don to stop their hostilities before they begin fighting with their children, but it's all for naught. Obi-Wan helps Neild and Sarasi destroy the city's deflection towers, opening the city up for the Young who are hiding in the countryside to march into the capital. It looks as though the Malida, the Don, and the Young will all be going to battle with each other, and Obi-Wan pleads with his master to help the Young in the upcoming war. But Qui-Gon refuses. He reminds Obi-Wan that their mission was to free Tal and bring her back to the Jedi Temple for medical attention. Qui-Gon tells Obi-Wan that if he doesn't return with him, then Obi-Wan can no longer be a Jedi. Obi-Wan says the plight of the Young is more important than the Jedi Code. Obi-Wan hands Qui-Gon his lightsaber and then watches his master blast off, heading back to Coruscant. Book number 6 is called The Uncertain Path. Obi-Wan remains on Malida Don, fighting alongside Sarasi and Neild as they lead the Young against their elders. Surprisingly, the Young win the war and set up a new government. Neild is elected governor, and his first order of business is to destroy the halls of evidence. Obi-Wan and Sarasi think that Neild is making a mistake. They think he should be focused on making sure everyone has enough food, clothing, and fuel before the winter, and before the Young start dismantling the halls. Neild calls Obi-Wan an off-worlder and turns the Young against him. Meanwhile, on Coruscant, Yoda orders Qui-Gon and Tal to investigate a series of thefts in the Jedi Temple. Most of the missing items are pretty innocuous, but then the thief snatches a few lightsabers and a bunch of healing crystals. Qui-Gon and Tal discover that Brooke Chun, a classmate of Obi-Wan, is behind the thefts. When Qui-Gon recovers the stolen goods from Chun's hiding spot, the boy flees the Jedi Temple. Now back on Malida Don, Neild leads a group of the young to destroy the Hall of Evidence where Cerasi's mother's ashes are buried. They're confronted by a group of the Malida elders, including Cerasi's own father. As the tensions rise, Obi-Wan and Cerasi arrive to try to keep the two sides from fighting again. Suddenly, someone fires a shot. Obi-Wan looks to his right, and Cerasi falls to the ground, dead. The tragedy leads to the young and the elders declaring war on each other. Again. Obi-Wan is devastated, and with nowhere else to turn, he calls back to the Jedi Temple and asks the Council for help. Of course, the Jedi send Qui-Gon Jinn. The Jedi Master helps Obi-Wan discover that it was one of the young from the countryside, a boy named Mawat, who had Cerasi killed. It turns out that Mawat wants another war. He wants to take over control of the government from Neild, and he wants to punish the elders for all of the years of fighting. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan tell Neild what has happened, and together, the three of them stop the fighting by using a recording that Cerasi made imploring the young and the elders to remain peaceful. The story ends with Qui-Gon welcoming Obi-Wan back to the Jedi Temple, but refusing to take Obi-Wan back as his Padawan learner. So the reason I decided to talk about two books together at the beginning of this episode rather than individually, like in the first episode of the year, is because I really enjoyed this arc. These two books tell one story in the history of Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Of course, these are young reader books. This is my first time reading them. I am not the intended audience for these stories. As such, there's a lot of the plot in these books that are not my favorite. In fact, some of the plot is a little silly, in my opinion. But what I really like is the interaction between Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the fact that each one challenges the other. Obi-Wan, in these first 6 books, and especially in the two that I just spoke about, Defenders of the Dead and The Uncertain Path, has a hard time understanding why Qui-Gon makes some of the decisions that he makes. Qui-Gon, on the other hand, occasionally gets frustrated by the amount of times that Obi-Wan challenges him and the decisions that he makes. It's one of the reasons why, as much as I understand the people who really like Qui-Gon Jinn in The Phantom Menace, and like to point out that Qui-Gon was right about many things that the Jedi Council missed with the rising of the dark side of the Force, with the Sith coming back to power. I have some issues with Qui-Gon's decision-making. In The Phantom Menace, when they get to Tatooine, it's clear that Qui-Gon becomes enamored with Anakin Skywalker because of the Chosen One prophecy. Qui-Gon's mission in that movie begins with trying to negotiate with the Trade Federation to stop the blockade of Naboo. It transforms somewhat into getting word back to Coruscant about what is happening on Naboo. However, once they get to Tatooine, it seems like Qui-Gon decides that what is more important than his mission is bringing Anakin Skywalker to the Jedi. Obi-Wan challenges his master in The Phantom Menace about this, which is why I really liked how this 2-book arc puts a mirror up to Qui-Gon's face. Now, I know what you're going to say. Aaron, these books take place earlier in the timeline. Yes, I understand that, but they were published after The Phantom Menace came out. So, it really is a mirror image of the dynamic that Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon have in The Phantom Menace, where Obi-Wan finds a purpose that feels bigger to him, feels in some ways more righteous to him than the mission that the Jedi Council gave to Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan is saying, this is more important. I understand the choice that I am making, because Qui-Gon gives him several opportunities in these stories to reflect on the choices that he is making. Ultimately, at the end of the first book, Defenders of the Dead, where Qui-Gon says, look, you are going down a path that the Jedi are not supposed to go. You are entangling yourself in the lives of the people of Malida Dawn to the point where you are choosing sides here. We're not supposed to do that. We are here to bring Tal back to Coruscant and, if possible, negotiate a truce between all the warring factions. Well, that was before they knew that a third faction, the Young, existed. And what is it the Young want? The Young want to put an end to all the fighting. And this is one of the reasons why I occasionally have an issue with Qui-Gon Jinn. I understand trying to force Tatooine to give up the slave trade in order to free both Anakin and his mother Shmi was way too big of an endeavor for one Jedi to accomplish. I understand that. But in these 2 books, particularly the first book, Obi-Wan is saying part of our remit as Jedi is to try to lower the temperature in a confrontation. Try to broker a peace between all sides. And especially with the fact that one of the 3 sides in this conflict on Malida Dawn is a group of children. If nothing else, Qui-Gon, you should want to help protect these children. So the actual plot points, the action sequences, the different battles, they're all fine. They're all well and good. But for me, the parts of these 2 stories that I really, really, really like are how the author Jude Watson uses Obi-Wan and the decisions he makes to reflect the decisions that Qui-Gon makes in The Phantom Menace. Now, coming up after the break, I'll talk more about the Jedi Apprentice series. I'm Aaron Moats, and you're listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. Thank you for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, where we celebrate the books from Star Wars Legends. But let me take a moment and recommend a book from Star Wars canon. Convergence is the first story in Phase 2 of the High Republic Publishing Initiative. The twin planets of Irem and Arano have been fighting for generations. When the Jedi sends a delegation to broker a ceasefire, it quickly becomes apparent that the two worlds are merely pawns in someone else's game. Unravel the mystery in Convergence by Zoraida Cordova. Welcome back to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Motes. Today, I'm talking about book numbers 5 through 8 in the Jedi Apprentice Young Reader series. The 7th book in the series is called The Captive Temple. Obi-Wan joins Qui-Gon and Tal as they continue their investigation into Bruk Chun and whoever he is working with to steal things around the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. But Obi-Wan's return to the temple is not exactly a warm one. He faces skepticism from the Jedi Council and outright scorn from some of his former classmates. Still, Obi-Wan is grateful for the chance to redeem himself in the eyes of his former master for the choices that he made at Malai Dadan. But that's going to have to wait, because the incidents at the temple quickly escalate. Someone attacks Master Yoda in the Room of 1,000 Fountains. They cut the power in different areas of the temple, making everything a hassle. And in one especially harrowing attack, the power goes out on a turbo lift full of younglings above the temple's lake level. Obi-Wan climbs the scaffolding to reach the lift and helps transfer the children to safety on a nearby platform. In the aftermath of the attacks, Qui-Gon senses a familiar presence, that of his former Padawan, Xanatos. Now, the Jedi believe that Xanatos has returned to take his revenge on his former master, and Qui-Gon says he's sure that's part of it, but he reminds everyone that Xanatos never does anything for one reason only. There's always an ulterior motive for his actions. And quickly, Qui-Gon figures out what is actually going on. All of the attacks are distractions to keep the Jedi from focusing on Xanatos' true intention: to steal a cache of valuable Vertex crystals that are being held in the temple's vault. Why? To pay for the operating costs of the off-world mining corporation that Xanatos runs. Now that they know exactly what they're looking for, Qui-Gon and Tal lay a trap for Xanatos and Bruk. And the trap works, partially. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan confront Xanatos at the vault, but he has one trick left up his sleeve. He has Bruk kidnap a youngling and hold her in the Room of 1,000 Fountains. Obi-Wan goes after Bruk while Qui-Gon duels with Xanatos. Qui-Gon stops his former Padawan from stealing the Vertex crystals, but Xanatos is able to escape the temple, and he heads off to the planet Telos. Now, meanwhile, Obi-Wan and Bruk fight at the top of one of the waterfalls in the Room of 1,000 Fountains. The confrontation ends when Bruk's foot slips. Obi-Wan reaches out to try to save his former rival, but he misses. Bruk plummets to the ground below, to his death. The story ends with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan heading off to Telos to find Xanatos. The final story in today's episode, the 8th book in the series, is called The Day of Reckoning. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan travel to Telos, intending on arresting Xanatos. But when they arrive on the planet, instead of finding the beautiful, peaceful, intellectual world that they expect, they discover a place where Xanatos controls almost everything. The government, the financial system, the culture, everything. and his most effective tool is a series of competitions that feature a public lottery called Catharsis. All of this is to distract the planet's population from the fact that Offworld is mining the planet's sacred cultural sites, stealing Telos's natural resources. As Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan investigate Catharsis, Xanatos sends his goons after the Jedi. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan are arrested, but they escape with the help of a woman named Andra, the leader of the opposition political party, and a con man named Den. Together, the group exposes Xanatos' activities, which include rigging the Catharsis lottery and off-world mining Telos's sacred pools. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan chase Xanatos to the mining site and confront him near one of the waste pools. After a brief lightsaber battle, Qui-Gon disarms Xanatos. He tries to take his former Padawan into custody, but before he can, Xanatos steps back into the waste pool and commits suicide. The story ends with the Jedi returning to Coruscant. They talk about all the choices that they've made recently and what they've learned from them. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan both apologize to one another before Qui-Gon asks Obi-Wan to return to his side as his Padawan learner. So these two stories are a nice bookend to the episode here. I will say I liked books 5 and 6 a little more than I did books 7 and 8, but 7 and 8 were pretty good. I found myself at this point just a little bored with the investigation and search for Xanatos. I liked the fact that he still was a thorn in Qui-Gon's side. I'm not sure I fully understand the issues between Qui-Gon and Xanatos, other than the fact that every time Qui-Gon would remember his former Padawan, that Xanatos always had a bit of a selfish streak. But that being said, of the two books, I preferred number 8, The Day of Reckoning. The Captive Temple was an interesting look at Detective Obi-Wan and Detective Qui-Gon, and I enjoyed how the mystery unfolded. I understood why the author used Bruck Chun as someone who Xanatos could take advantage of and turn against the Jedi. Xanatos is using any means necessary to get back at his former master, Qui-Gon Jinn. Well, who's Qui-Gon's Padawan currently? Obi-Wan Kenobi. In the first book, The Rising Force, we learned that Obi-Wan and Bruck are rivals. And there's a bit of jealousy that Bruck has with Obi-Wan's abilities, and the fact that even though Obi-Wan was initially slated for the Jedi Agricultural Corps, he eventually is chosen to be a Padawan learner. So Xanatos plays on Bruck's jealousy. But I don't know. These books were published in the year 2000, so I'm looking at these through a 2025 lens. I think that turning Bruck and then making Obi-Wan watch in futility as Bruck dies from falling off the side of the waterfall, for me, is a little much for a young reader book. And in the second story, The Day of Reckoning, I think the way that Xanatos dies is a little much for a young reader book. But, as I said before, I'm not the target audience. Now, what I did like about The Day of Reckoning, and as I said, I think I preferred this story to book number 7, The Captive Temple, was how surprised Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan were with how Xanatos was able to, quote-unquote, corrupt the entire planet of Telos, and how he was able to distract them in order to take advantage of them by setting up this entertainment, these games that the public could wager upon, to keep them from looking at the fact that off-world mining was stealing the planet's natural resources. As I say, I'm looking at this through an adult lens, through a middle-aged man's lens. And it reminds me of several times throughout my life where it seems as though a person or group of people have taken advantage of a less fortunate group of people by distracting them with some form of entertainment in order to keep them from looking at what their actual motives are, in order to exploit the situation for their own good. I think that's a pretty heavy lesson for a young reader book, but I like that Jude Watson and Star Wars did that. I think at times, younger readers, younger people in general, are able to process more adult things than what many adults like to believe. Again, my favorite parts of these stories, regardless of the plots, are the relationships between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. And in these two books, we see numerous times where each of the main characters has this inner monologue where they are trying to figure out how best to communicate with the other one. Qui-Gon's trying to figure out how to talk to Obi-Wan about the fact that Obi-Wan hurt him by turning away from the Jedi, and that Qui-Gon made some mistakes, thinking that Obi-Wan would simply go along with everything that Qui-Gon said. And Obi-Wan is having problems talking to Qui-Gon about the feelings that he had at Malida Dawn, and the feelings that he had afterwards, mostly that he disappointed Qui-Gon, that he let him down. It's realistic. It's poignant. It shows how everyone struggles with having difficult conversations with their loved ones. And for the most part, I like the way it was presented. I do think it went on a little too long for my liking. There were a few times where it appeared that either Qui-Gon or Obi-Wan was going to start opening up in order to speak to the other, and then right as they began saying what they needed to say, something happened in the plot that then said, "Oh, I'll talk to you about it later," or "We'll talk about that some other time, but now we have to do this, or we have to do that first." But the quote-unquote, "I'll talk to you about it later" trope, it's effective storytelling, but to me it can get frustrating when it is used over and over again. And I think that the author just used it a few too many times in these two stories. Well, it's time to wrap up, but before I do, I wanted to share another quick email from longtime listener Robin, who sent me a message when he saw that I was going to talk about the Jedi Apprentice series here at the beginning of this season. Robin says, "Hello, Aaron. I am very happy that you have started with the Jedi Padawan books in your podcast, or what I like to call them, the Jude Watson books. They always give me Animorph vibes. Can't really speak to the Animorph books. I have seen a bunch of the covers. I have never read a page of any of them. They're a little young for me. I've just never read any Animorphs. But if we're just going by the covers, I know what they look like." Anyway, Robin continues, "I really like this time in the galaxy. There's no Clone Wars, no Galactic Empire, no Rebellion, no Sith Lords most of the time. There's no Darth Vader or Emperor Palpatine. It shows a brave new world, one where the Jedi Knights are given more time to work like a detective and solve crimes, something the reader can do in real life without the help of a lightsaber. It also shows you a very interesting version of Obi-Wan Kenobi. That guy always was a chick magnet." Well, I haven't gotten that as much in these first few stories, but Robin, I'll take your word for it. As I go through the series, we'll see how often Obi-Wan catches the eye of a young lady. It seemed to me that in books 5 and 6, The Defenders of the Dead and The Uncertain Path, that it was more Obi-Wan that was attracted to someone. It seemed like he was attracted to Sarassi more than the other way around. Robin also says that the picture used for Bruck Chun on Wikipedia looks a lot like his cousin David when his cousin was younger. Thank you very much again for the email, Robin. Listener, if you'd like to contact me, you can send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Blue Sky, Instagram, or Twitter at swlegendslounge. Send me your questions, comments, your favorite character groupings. I'll read them here on the show. And I still want to see some photos of any cool Star Wars gifts that anyone got over the holidays. I haven't gotten any photos yet. Please send me those pictures. I love looking at that stuff. Coming up on the next episode, I will recap the next group of 4 stories in the Jedi Apprentice series. Those books are The Fight for Truth, The Shattered Peace, The Deadly Hunter, and The Evil Experiment, all by Jude Watson. You can look forward to that episode coming out on February 6th, which, coincidentally, is also the date of the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics. Remember, if you want to see the full schedule for 2026, just check out my pinned posts on both Blue Sky and Twitter. Thank you so much for listening today to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. I'm Aaron Moats. May the Force be with you. And remember, there's always a bit of truth in legends.